culture trafficking, illegal excavations and the antiquities trade. In the interview, the president of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, Hermann Partzinger.
Mr. Partzinger, why should museums today be extremely careful when dealing with ancient antiquities?
We know
that illegal excavations and grave robbing are an enormous worldwide problem. Not just in countries that are in turmoil, but even in Germany, where there continues to be an illegal trade in antiquities. It's worth billions in trade each year. That's why I believe the question of provenance, of legal provenance, and the legal trade in antiquities is of central importance for museums.
Criminologists always talk about the trade in illegal antiquities in the same breath as the weapons and illegal drug trades. Are there estimates as to how big the global trade in illegal antiquities is?
It's true that they're often linked together. I don't know if that's absolutely the case, but the fact is that it is an international trade. It's not a question of whether the trade is worth 1 million, 1 billion, or 3 billion a year. But the addiction to profit is a real threat to humanity's cultural heritage, and we have to rein it in.
You're an archaeologist yourself. You've worked in Turkey, Russia, and Central Asia. Did you come in contact with grave robbers there?
I did come into contact with the damage the grave robbers caused. You find robbed graves in almost all of those countries. You see that especially when the burial site is above ground, as a grave mound, or if it's covered by rocks. You know where to look in those cases. You see that frequently, and sometimes you come up against the grave robbers, as I did in northern Pakistan. It was there that I ended up looking down the barrel of a Kalashnikov. We came by chance upon grave robbers, and we surprised them as they were robbing a stupa, a holy Buddhist structure that contained relics which they were removing.
It's known that the Taliban partly financed their operations in Afghanistan by grave robbing. The same is true of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. What role do stolen antiquities play today in financing international terrorism and in Islamist terrorism?
We know that members of IS, of Islamic State, have engaged in grave robbing, and that they have sold antiquities illegally. I can't say how big a source of income that is, however. But it remains a fact that the damage to cultural heritage is immeasurable. That doesn't just apply to cultural artifacts that have been removed through illegal excavations and sold. It also applies to the case of the Buddha statues of Bamiyan, or the mosque in Mosul that was destroyed by Islamic State just a few weeks ago, or the Islamist group in Timbuktu in Mali, who a few months ago destroyed holy Islamic graves. We're seeing the loss and destruction of Islamic culture being pursued with total zeal, and that is something that is simply unspeakable.
What does that look like in reality? An IS group in Syria discovers something. How do they get those artifacts onto the market?
It's relatively simple to remove objects from the ground in Syria or in Iraq. They identify places of antiquity. They can identify mud brick structures that have deformed over the ages. You don't need the eye of an archaeologist to do that. Those places are relatively well known. And there's also plenty of literature available, as well as tourist guidebooks. They simply take a bulldozer or metal detector, and they try to find evidence of important archaeological items. Then they tear them from the ground. They deal in objects that the grave robbers can quickly turn into as much money as possible. Works of art, clay tablets, and similar items. They're less interested in textiles, which are extremely important to archaeologists. Then those objects end up in illegal channels that have international connections. The question is, who's making the largest amount of money at which point? The international trade in illegal antiquities has meeting points around the world. No matter where antiquities come from, whether it's Syria, Latin America, Africa, or from Germany, they're being traded internationally.
What's the best way for the authorities to combat the international network of dealers?
First of all, it's mainly a problem of crisis countries where the state structures and authorities have to be reestablished. There needs to be an infrastructure, and the public needs to be made aware of what's happening. When villagers who live near a place of antiquity see grave robbers, they must be made aware that they're destroying our past, our history, and they have to take action by informing the police at the very least if they see that happening. That applies to people in Germany as much as it does to people in Iraq. The second thing we need are effective laws in the countries where we know that there is illegal trade in antiquities. That's why the reform of Germany's cultural treasure law, which politicians are planning, is of such immense importance. That will limit Germany as a focal point for the illegal trade.
Let's talk about Germany a little more for a moment. Almost every court case involving illegal trade in antiquities has been dropped. Why is that the case? Why is it that the illegal trade in antiquities is treated as a minor offence? How do you explain that?
Yes, it's true that that is a widely held belief, but things are changing when it comes to the public's perception, such as when someone visits Turkey as a tourist or any other country, and they're offered antiques to buy as souvenirs. People need to be clear that that is not only illegal, but by buying antiquities, they're encouraging the destruction of cultural heritage.
The United Nations and UNESCO have an organisation dedicated to protecting cultural artefacts. How are they dealing with the problem of stolen antiquities and the trade in illegal goods?
Many years ago, in 1970, UNESCO agreed a convention that is extremely important for this subject. It's aimed at limiting the illegal trade in stolen antiquities. But that convention can only be effective when it's integrated into national law. Germany did that in 2008. However, according to the law, cultural artifacts are only protected when they're specifically listed. That has made legal disputes very complicated. We have to acknowledge two things at this point. First, not every museum in the world has a full list of cultural artifacts and has published it internationally. That's one point. The main area of concern is illegal excavation, objects that are still in the ground and which thieves remove from the earth. Those things cannot be listed. That's a crucial issue. The reform of the law dictates that you have to have an official document proving an artifact's origin. You also need to have an official document approving export from the country of origin and not just from a third country.
There's a proposal that could have very big consequences. The suggestion is to ban the global trade in antiquities completely. That would solve the problem in one swoop because the market would dry up. What do you think of that?
Yes, that would be a radical solution. But there is trade in antiquities which is legal. There are many objects that have been in collections since the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Why should they not be traded further? I don't think there's a problem with that. I think the simplest thing to do is to adapt the relevant laws so that they can be effective and that they're put into practice in reality. There's another point where laws don't help at all. The police and customs authorities need to be able to recognize illegal antiquities. Recently, we published in Germany the red list of objects from Syria drawn up by the International Council of Museums. That list has categories and groups of antiquities that are characteristic for cultures that existed in Syrian territory. If such objects turn up, then the authorities, the customs authorities, will immediately be able to recognize that they could have their origins in Syria, and then they can take action.
You've mentioned collections in Western museums. Every so often there is quite passionate debate about returning certain historic objects to their country of origin. Here in Berlin, the Nefertiti bust, which Egypt has made repeated claims on, is often mentioned. Germany says that claim is not legitimate. Can you briefly explain the situation as it stands now?
It's important to say immediately that the Egyptian government has never made an official demand for the return of the Nefertiti bust. Those claims were made by individuals, by former representatives of the Antiquities authorities, or by the media. But there's no official request for the return because it's known that at the time there was a law defining how antiquities were to be shared out. When a foreign archaeological team carried out a dig with the permission of the Egyptians, the discovered artifacts would be divided up as compensation for the expenses the team had paid out. The same was true in Turkey. That system applied to the finding of Nefertiti. At the time, the Egyptian authorities had to receive a complete list and photographs of the most important pieces before dividing up the find. The fairy tale that the Nefertiti bust was in a box covered with clay and that the Egyptians knew nothing about it is completely false. At the time, the Egyptians were more interested in another artifact in the find. We have to recognize that the hype surrounding Nefertiti only came later. In short, the important thing is whether these objects were legally claimed at the time of the find. That's the guiding concept for us. Every museum needs to be ready to discuss returning an object to its rightful owners if in the course of researching its provenance, it's found that it was illegally obtained. That applies not only to antiquities stolen by the Nazis, but to all cultural artifacts.
Right at the very beginning, you mentioned stolen artifacts in Germany. Grave robbing and its associated commercial aspect is something that happens more often in the Near and Middle East. In Germany, it's about treasure hunters with metal detectors. How much damage are they causing?
Of course, they're causing enormous damage. Just imagine that the most important archaeological find of Europe's prehistoric era, the bronze Nebra sky disk, was found illegally a few years ago. The disk is the oldest known representation of the cosmos. It's an astonishing work of abstraction. It was here in what is now Germany that our ancestors turned the observation of the heavens into a two-dimensional object long before the ancient Egyptians. That's amazing. If that object had disappeared down an illegal channel, we wouldn't know anything about it today.
Hermann Partzinger, President of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, thank you for giving your insights to Deutsche Welle.
Gerne.